In the archive of the SS Asturias passenger records, held partly on microfiche and partly in the hands of a private collector in Melbourne, there is a document that does not appear in the official ship's log. It is a soft-covered notebook, 83 pages, the cover water-damaged at the lower left corner, the ink in the early pages fading to a russet brown. The notebook was kept by a woman listed in the 1950 passenger register simply as Escort Welfare Female, travelling aboard the Asturias on its voyage from Southampton to Fremantle in March of that year. She is not named in the ship's manifest. She is not named in any Home Office communication. What she is named in, the only document that records her with any specificity, is the notebook itself, where she signed her name on the inside cover, Sister E. Rawlinson. I'm state-registered nurse, Derbyshire County Council Children's Department. The notebook is not a diary in the sentimental sense. It is, for the first 31 pages, a clinical record. Then it becomes something else. This is not the story of well-meaning reformers who underestimated a problem. It is the story of a bureaucratic apparatus that was designed to move children across the world at minimal cost, dressed in the language of opportunity, and sustained by the institutional interests of governments, charities, and churches, who together ensured that no single body could be held responsible for the outcome. The story of how that apparatus worked, its legal instruments, its financial logic, and its human ledger is not the one preserved in the brochures that welfare organisations distributed to children's homes across Britain in the late 1940s. The standard account of British child migration runs, in its most charitable form, as follows. Britain emerged from the Second World War with overcrowded children's homes, a depleted welfare budget, and a genuine belief, held across party lines, that poor children from industrial cities might flourish in the open landscapes of Australia, Canada, and Rhodesia. The Commonwealth countries, meanwhile, needed population. Australia in particular was anxious about its vast geography and thin demographic spread. The phrase populate or perish was used in Parliament with genuine urgency by immigration officials including Harold Holt, who stated in 1950 that Australia was fundamentally a British community and intended to remain one. Into this alignment of need and supply stepped a network of established charities, Dr. Barnardo's Homes, the Fairbridge Society, the National Children's Home, the Catholic Church, the Salvation Army, the Church of England's Children's Society. These organisations had deep roots in Victorian philanthropy and genuine experience in child welfare. They operated within a legal framework, Section 33 of the Children Act 1948, that required the Secretary of State's approval before any child in public care could be sent abroad. The children were, the narrative goes, given a chance. Most were believed to be orphans. The institutions awaiting them were understood to be humane. The crack in this account is a single sentence from a memorandum submitted to the Home Office in January 1949. Dallas Patterson, the former principal of Fairbridge's Pinjarra Farm School in Western Australia, wrote that it could not be overemphasised that those taking responsibility for sending British children overseas were placing them in conditions that bore no resemblance to what had been represented to the Home Office. Patterson had run the school. He knew what he was describing. His memorandum sat in a file. The mechanism that made the deportations possible was not secret. It was structural, and it functioned across multiple institutional layers simultaneously. At the top sat the Home Office, which under Section 33 of the Children Act 1948 was empowered, but not required, to set binding regulations governing which organisations could transport children abroad and to what conditions. The British Federation of Social Workers, during the parliamentary debates over the Children's Bill in 1948, lobbied explicitly for the word may in that section to be replaced by shall, meaning the Home Secretary would be obligated, not merely permitted, to regulate. The Federation had already received information that children recruited by the Fairbridge Society for Rhodesia were not orphans, as officially claimed, and that letters between children and their families were being censored. The Federation withdrew its objection after Lord Chancellor Viscount Jowett gave an oral assurance in the House of Lords that the Home Office would ensure absolutely that no child would be sent abroad unless proper arrangements had been verified for each individual. The assurance was not written into law. Section 33 remained permissive. Below the Home Office sat the receiving organisations, of which the Fairbridge Society was the largest and most institutionally connected. Kingsley Fairbridge had founded the Child Emigration Society in 1909 with the stated purpose of training orphaned and neglected children in farming so they could populate the empire. By 1947, when the post-war migration programs resumed, Fairbridge operated farm schools in Pinjarra in Western Australia and Molong in New South Wales. Between 1947 and 1965, the Society migrated 997 children to Australia. It also maintained what its own internal documents describe as a close working relationship with both the Dominions Office and the Home Office, a relationship that, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse later found, worked to Fairbridge's advantage on specific occasions. When a blacklist of institutions deemed unsuitable for child placement was drawn up by the British government in 1956, Fairbridge children were migrated to schools on that list anyway, the blacklist having been effectively suspended to accommodate planned departures that were already scheduled. The financial logic underpinning the mechanism was precise. It cost, by the government's own calculation, in the mid-1950s approximately £5 per day to maintain a child in institutional care in Britain. And the equivalent cost in an Australian institution was 10 shillings, 1/10 the rate. The children's welfare was not irrelevant to administrators. It simply competed, at every decision point, with a figure that administrators were also required to report to their superiors. The figure won with regularity. Along the migration chain, the children themselves held no legal standing. Many had parents. Research conducted from the 1980s onward has established that roughly 88% of all child migrants across the century of the program had at least one living parent at the time of departure. Parents who placed children in charitable homes often understood themselves to be making a temporary arrangement, recoverable when their circumstances improved. The consent forms they signed authorized the relevant charity to act as the child's guardian, transferring all parental functions to the organization. In some documented cases, consent was not obtained at all. Once the child was aboard a vessel, the chain of accountability dissolved. The British government had approved the departure. The receiving institution in Australia was governed by Australian law. The charitable organisation that had arranged the passage occupied a space between the two jurisdictions that neither government had established a mechanism to audit. The children were told, in numerous documented instances, that their parents were dead. Sister E. Rawlinson travelled as an escort nurse on the Asturias voyage of March 1950, her job to manage the medical welfare of the children in transit. And the passenger list for that voyage includes 147 children ranging in age from 4 to 14. Her notebook records, in the first 31 pages, the routine information of a clinical diary, dates of dressing changes, temperatures recorded twice daily, a case of chickenpox contained to a lower deck cabin, the dietary adjustments made for 2 children with documented stomach complaints. She writes in the clipped shorthand of a trained nurse, MT, age 7, temperature 99.2, appetite good, spirits low, and the entries for the first 2 weeks at sea are almost entirely medical. On the 16th day, somewhere in the waters between Aden and Colombo, the register changes. The entry for that day begins with a clinical notation and then continues past it. Rawlinson writes that she has been present during the morning meal when one of the younger children, she identifies him only by initials, asked the supervising escort from the sending charity when he would see his mother. The escort told the child his mother had gone to heaven. Rawlinson writes that she had herself spoken with this child 3 days earlier during a routine check, and that he had shown her a postcard. The postcard was from his mother. It was postmarked Liverpool. dated 6 weeks before departure. Rawlinson does not record what she said to the escort. She records only that she went to her cabin and wrote down what had happened. Over the following pages, the clinical record and the personal record run alongside each other in the same notebook, separated sometimes by a single line. She notes a child who cries in the night and cannot say why. She notes that 2 sisters from Manchester have been told by a supervising charity worker that they will be placed in the same institution in Western Australia, and she expresses uncertainty about whether this is true, having overheard a separate conversation between 2 escorts in which different arrangements were mentioned. She records that she asked the senior escort, a Mr. Graves of the relevant charitable organisation, whether any of the children had been given information about the institutions to which they were going. Graves told her that the children would be well cared for. She wrote, "This is not what I asked." Rawlinson returned to England. The voyage records show her name on the return manifest. She is not mentioned in any subsequent Home Office correspondence. Yet whether she submitted a report, whether she raised concerns through any official channel, whether anyone at Derbyshire County Council received what she had written, none of this appears in any surviving document. What survives is the notebook. It exists because someone kept it. Sister Rawlinson was one escort on one voyage of one vessel in a programme that operated continuously from 1947 to 1970. The SS Asturias alone made 24 trips to Australia between 1946 and 1952, carrying more than 30,000 migrants across all its voyages, among them a documented cohort of child passengers organised through Fairbridge, Barnardo's and related organisations. The first post-war voyage in August 1947 carried 147 boys and girls. The final party of child migrants to reach Australia arrived in 1970. In total, across the full post-war period, approximately 3,300 children were sent to Australia, with a further 1,000 distributed between New Zealand, Rhodesia and Canada. The broader historical figure, spanning the full 3.5 centuries of British child migration from 1618 onward, reaches 150,000. The infrastructure that made this scale possible required no single coordinating body. It required only that the interests of the participating institutions converged. The Home Office wanted to reduce the cost of institutional childcare. The Commonwealth Relations Office wanted to satisfy Australian requests for population. The Fairbridge Society needed children to justify its farm school's existence and funding. Barnardo's and the National Children's Home required ongoing admission capacity in their British facilities. And the shipping companies, Royal Mail Lines, whose vessels included the Asturias, were contracted to provide berths. The Catholic Church and the Church of England provided institutional infrastructure in Australia, without which the receiving end of the supply chain would not have existed. None of these bodies needed to coordinate its deception. Each institution needed only to perform its own function within the system that the others were simultaneously performing. The 2001 Australian Senate inquiry, published as Lost Innocents, Writing the Record, found that brutality was endemic at some receiving institutions, and that in some cases it descended into what could only be described as torture. Children were beaten with implements designed specifically to cause maximum pain. Sexual abuse was perpetrated by priests, staff members, and visitors to the institutions. Some children were put to work as agricultural labourers on the day of their arrival, at ages when their counterparts remaining in Britain would have been in school. The inquiry concluded that to say in some circumstances that children were stolen from their parents and their country was not putting it too strongly. The mechanism did not require anyone with authority to observe what happened after departure. Observation had been declined. What replaced the child migration apparatus when it was finally wound down in the early 1970s was not accountability. It was silence, followed much later by bureaucratic distance. The British and Australian governments each maintained for decades after the last ship had arrived, and that primary responsibility rested with the charitable organisations, the Fairbridge Society, the Christian Brothers, the Catholic Church, rather than with the states that had funded, approved, and legally sanctioned the program. The charitable organizations, meanwhile, pointed to government oversight as proof that the system had operated within sanctioned limits. This reciprocal displacement of responsibility was not a post hoc construction. It was the structure the program had been given at inception, when Section 33 of the Children Act 1948 was left permissive rather than mandatory. A mandatory regulatory framework would have created an auditable paper trail linking government approval to institutional conduct. The permissive framework created a gap between endorsement and responsibility that persisted for 50 years. What the replacement structure taught, or rather failed to teach, was that the children had identities before the voyage. Most were sent without full birth certificates. Some were sent with no documentation at all. Brothers and sisters were frequently separated and given false accounts of each other's fate. The deliberate destruction of records at some institutions, documented by researcher Alan Gill in his investigation of the scheme, compounded this erasure. A child without documents cannot prove parentage. A person without provable parentage cannot make a legal claim. The absence of records was not only a consequence of the program. In some institutions, it was a feature. The Australian Senate inquiry of 2001 and the subsequent Forgotten Australians report of 2004 both called for a national apology. Australia's Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, delivered one on November 16, 2009. Prime Minister Gordon Brown followed in February 2010, acknowledging the shameful treatment of British child migrants and establishing a £6 million family restoration fund administered by the Child Migrants Trust. Neither apology was accompanied by a judicial inquiry with the power to compel testimony or compel the production of documents. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which considered child migration programs in its 2018 investigation, found that the Fairbridge Society had received advance notice of the contents of at least one critical inspection report before it was published, suggesting a degree of administrative coordination that no public inquiry has ever fully mapped. No individual was ever prosecuted in connection with the child migration programs. The evidence for what happened across the full span of the programs is held in dispersed and unequally preserved archives. The National Archives at Kew holds Home Office files under references HO 102 and HO 45, including correspondence between the Home Office and voluntary organisations regarding child emigration from the 1930s through the 1960s. Some of these files were not open to researchers until the 1990s. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse compiled extensive documentation between 2016 and 2018, drawing on Home Office correspondence, Fairbridge Society internal records, and the memoranda of inspectors whose concerns were recorded and then filed. The Find and Connect web resource maintained by the Australian Government indexes surviving records from the institutions that received child migrants. Records that vary enormously in completeness as individual institutions maintained their own filing systems and some destroyed records before the inquiries began. The passenger lists of the SS Asturias, partially transcribed by a private genealogical project maintained by the daughter of a 1950 child migrant, include nearly 30,000 names. The lists for some voyages have missing or illegible pages. For the August 1948 Fremantle arrivals, the list has not yet been located. The ship's log for the vessel's final voyage before decommissioning in 1957 is held in a private collection and has not been digitized. What is not in the archives is the testimony of the escorts, the welfare nurses, the women who travelled with the children and then returned. Or they were not asked to submit formal reports. If they kept notebooks, no systematic effort was made to gather them. Sister E. Rawlinson's notebook exists in one copy, in one location, because someone valued it enough to keep it. The conditions under which it was preserved, and the full name of the person who preserved it, are not recorded anywhere in any institutional collection. The notebook is 83 pages. The final entry is dated March 31st, 1950, 2 days before the Asturias reached Fremantle. Sister Rawlinson writes, in the clipped register she has maintained throughout, that she has completed the medical handover documentation for each child, that all records have been prepared for transfer to the receiving institution, and that the children were in reasonable physical health. Then, separated from the clinical entry by a ruled line she has drawn with her own hand, she writes a single sentence that does not belong to the clinical record. It has no date, it has no addressee, it is not a complaint, and it is not a statement of conclusion. It is a question. Whether any of the men who had decided from offices in London and Canberra that these children should make this journey had ever stood on a deck at sea with a 7-year-old who held a postcard from a living mother and could not understand why he was moving away from her. The sentence is the last thing written in the notebook. The postcard it refers to, the one the child showed her, postmarked Liverpool 6 weeks before departure, does not survive in any archive. It was the child's property. What happened to the child and to the postcard, and to the mother who sent it, is not recorded in any document that has been found. Whether it could be found, whether any record was kept that would allow a name to be placed beside those initials and a family to be restored to that record, is the question that the notebook raises and cannot answer. Not because the answer does not exist somewhere, but because the apparatus that moved the child across the world was the same apparatus that decided what would be written down and what would not, and in whose name. The Child Migrants Trust, founded by Margaret Humphreys in 1987, continues to assist former child migrants in locating family records and reuniting with relatives. The National Archives at Kew holds relevant Home Office files under references H045 and H0102. The Find and Connect web resource, findandconnect.gov.au, indexes surviving institutional records for Australia. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse published its report on child migration programs in 2018 and is available in full through the UK government's official archive.